As a former soldier who's in Afghanistan 15 years ago, and I went back as a journalist last year watching what's unfolding in Afghanistan at the moment, it's a strange mix of feelings. I'm quite numb. I feel very concerned for the people I knew out there, members of my crew, my fixers and whatnot, people I interviewed as a young group of very young Afghan peace activists we interviewed, deeply concerned about them. But there's also an element of surprise, I think, because if you've followed the news about Afghanistan beyond the headlines in the last 10 years or so, it's not that much of a surprise. I mean, the speed of the Taliban advance isn't that much of a surprise if you're kind of locked into what's going on in Afghanistan. The fact that the Afghan army capitulated very quickly isn't that shocking because we know, or I know because I've been there and spoken to people, that the army was a ghost army. It was an army on paper, and lots of the soldiers who existed on the records weren't actually there. And I also know that large parts of the country have been under Taliban control, or at least outside government control, for many years. And I think that probably speaks, the shock in this country probably speaks to the media narrative, that we have a compliant media which has repeated government press releases on the progress, the supposed progress in Afghanistan, almost verbatim. The reality on the ground is that beyond Kabul and a few other major cities with a major military presence, the government's grip, and by extension the Western grip on power in Afghanistan, was always fairly tenuous. It was always creaking, and I think that's been borne out. So it's a strange mix of things, but I suppose most of it is concern for Afghan people who are incredibly hospitable and warm and welcoming, welcomed me there last year when I went back as a journalist. And so really it's concern for those people. And I'm always very careful to say, I have lots of friends in the military who suffered very badly. I know people who died in Afghanistan, friends who took their lives later. And it's a very British conceit to frame the problem of the Afghan war as being one about our soldiers being wounded or our soldiers being made sad. The primary victims are always going to be and have always been the Afghans. And I think we have to clarify that. And that's where my concern is at the moment. 23 probably when I first went to Afghanistan. I joined the army at 22. And the first time I ever got on a plane was an RAF TriStar to Kabul. We stopped off in Dubai, I think, and we flew into Kabul. Dawn was breaking. Astonishing. It's a beautifully picturesque city from the air with what we would call an incredibly hairy landing. It's hemmed in by mountains, the runway very closely, but spectacular to fly into. And I think that really came back to me yesterday, seeing the scenes, seeing those, the people who had obviously clung to landing gear falling out of the plane onto Kabuli rooftops, seeing Apache helicopters flying very low, clearing people off the runway, just the absolute chaos. And having been through that airport a number of times, several times on tour, going back and forth, and then last year as a journalist, I mean, it really brought that home to me. And to be honest, the bodies falling had a really eerie quality because it took me back to before I joined the army. I was probably kind of very late teens, very early 20s, 9/11, the bodies falling out of the towers. There was this weird kind of echo of that, and it was absolutely awful to see what was playing out, to see the end game playing out in Afghanistan, and seeing those thousands of desperate people, many with their children and families, clambering onto the exterior of a US military plane. It was absolutely bleak. Those almost like the little girl who's been burned with napalm in Vietnam. Iconic and awful picture. I think those scenes, the scenes of crowds of people running alongside a military cargo plane, will become iconic. As will the image of a Chinook over the embassy. I think Joe Biden said the other day, this isn't Saigon. And of course it's not literally Saigon, but the parallels are unmistakable. I don't think you can get away from that. Why we went to war in Afghanistan, I think that is a question which has burdened historians and will continue to burden historians, and also the people who served there in the military from various nations and Afghans. It's very confused. I think the narrative was very confused even when I went. Partially, I suspect it's a mixture of things, partially a revenge mission, a knee-jerk response to 9/11, And there are other reasons as well. I suspect, obviously, what we've seen in the last few days is the liberal interventionists who are actually repeating some of the same arguments about being for the benefit of women and children, as if the British military is some kind of feminist organisation, or the British establishment has feminist leanings. I think one of the most compelling arguments I've heard for the 2006 invasion, which is where I became involved as a young soldier, was that we occupied Helmand because we'd failed in American eyes in Basra, in Iraq. The war in Afghanistan, that phase of it is profoundly connected to the war in Iraq. We were given the city of Basra. That was our little corner of Iraq that the Brits were given to look after. We failed massively. And then we lobbied the Americans for another chance, always hanging onto American coattails as ever. And we got Helmand province and then proceeded to mess that up as badly. And that war, which was framed as a humanitarian operation, as peace building, as helping little girls go to school quickly, became a lightning rod for an insurgency and set the pattern for the rest of the period there until we officially withdrew in 2014. But also I think it set the pattern for the whole war up until today. Serving in Afghanistan, it's as I said, it was the first time I ever got on a plane, and we flew in there, incredibly hot. 2006, it got incredibly hot that year. I think at one point it hit 56, it's a figure that's hard to believe, but I've gone back and checked it, and it was it was hot, it was hard, it was harsh, it was arid, and that I say that as someone who wasn't on the front line. I was a logistician. I was working with the ammunition, but I suppose the tone of it was deeply confused. We've been given all these various reasons we were going, some from the military and some which our soldiers had picked up from the press, most of them with a kind of humanitarian bent. And when we got there, it quickly became clear that our presence was not welcome, and we quickly became a target for everyone in the region. There's a danger, there's still a danger now, that everybody who didn't want us there and responded aggressively to our presence was folded under the banner of Taliban. I suspect it's much more complicated than that. A lot of the people would have just been military-age men who didn't want us trampling through their backyards. But conveniently, everyone was folded into anti-coalition militia or some heading like that. But it became very quickly clear that whatever the supposedly noble motives we were told we were going for, whatever they were, whatever the official rationale was, that we had invaded a place where we weren't welcome, and very quickly the death toll started to mount. We ran out of artillery ammunition, not typical for a peacekeeping operation, and things snowballed from there, and it very much set the tone of the rest of the war. I think my objections to the Afghan war, they didn't crystallise on tour, but I started to look at the impact it was having on Afghan people. Clearly, it was lots of people were dying on both sides, but particularly affected, obviously, the Afghans. And those doubts certainly started to nag at me on operations. It was actually later, because you don't really have time on operations. You're busy, and you're under the hammer constantly. When I came back, that started to crystallise, and I started to question the rationale we'd been given. And I had planned to just leave the army, to sign off and leave. I was covered technically by Harmony guidelines, which is an 18-month period after an operational tour where you can't be redeployed. It became standard at that time that those guidelines were broken. That had lots of mental health impacts, as we've seen. Guys were doing back-to-back tours, Iraq, Afghan. And they ignored that. That was the case with me. They broke those guidelines and said I was redeploying. At which point I was kind of forced. I couldn't just quietly leave, serve out my time and leave. And I told my chain of command why I wasn't going back. They said I was. I said I wasn't. It was that kind of private to sergeant ping pong of yes I am, no I'm not. And at the same time I started to manifest PTSD. So it's probably a mix of those things, but my views definitely crystallised, at least as a moral objection, after I'd been in Afghanistan for 6 or 7 months and come back home. Later, I think I had an urge to try and understand the historical relationship between Britain and Afghanistan, America and Afghanistan, the history of Afghanistan, the history of imperial powers trying to intervene in Afghanistan. And so later on it became more of an informed political and historical analysis. But initially it was basically a kind of almost an instinctive moral objection. I suppose you would call it a conscientious objection. I don't know if that term quite covers it. But yeah, it was a kind of mixture of those factors, I think. A lot of people I know have obviously been affected. A guy from my regiment was killed on tour. Two guys from my regiment, one when I was on tour and one on a subsequent tour. One of my sergeants from basic training, who's a very well thought of individual, was later killed in an IED. Guys I knew have subsequently taken their lives. Various people I know are injured, physically, of course, but also mentally. Lots of people I know have different degrees of PTSD, moral injury, adjustment disorder. But I always try and emphasise, I sympathise with those people because they are my people, and that they're part of my composition. I was a soldier and I have sympathy with veterans, but I always try and emphasise that whatever the problems we had, we still go home. There's still some degree, I suppose, of choice in the fact we went and we come home to something resembling less and less as the days go by, an NHS, for example, some kind of healthcare and support networks. Afghans are home, they are home, and all those problems, they also suffer, and they're exacerbated by the fact they can't get out. So Afghans I know, the rates of PTSD are extremely high, lots of people have been injured, and now I think about the people I spent time with, particularly last year when I went back as a journalist rather than a soldier, the people I interviewed who are trying to muster hope and optimism for a better Afghan future, and I really worry about them and the conditions of their lives going forward. Whether this Taliban 2.0 is the same as the Taliban of 96 or 2001, I don't know. Time will only tell, but we know they're a deeply reactionary, conservative force, and lots of people will suffer going forward with Afghanistan back under their control. Was the money well spent? It's a huge figure. We're talking trillions of dollars, obviously. I think it depends who you are. The question of whether it was well spent depends who you are. Some people did benefit from the war in Afghanistan. I'm not among them. Your average Afghan isn't among those people. Arms firms benefited from the war in Afghanistan. Contractors, military contractors from the West, mercenary firms, if we're to call them what they are, benefited from the war in Afghanistan. And a lot of those people have squirreled their money away. They've cut and run, butchered and bolted, as we used to say about British imperial adventures. So some people did benefit. The people who we are told benefited, the Afghans, and a lot of the framing for that spending, justification for it was about it would improve Afghans' lives, lead to some fundamental progress in terms of human rights or infrastructure in Afghanistan, did not benefit. And I think that's obvious to see. I think the arguments that money was well spent in a really meaningful sense are dead in the water. I just don't buy it, to be honest. Sandhurst in the Sand was an officer training facility in Afghanistan, modelled loosely on in Sandhurst, where British military officers are trained. On the evidence of what we've seen, it produces an equal level of buffoons and cretins, because clearly it hasn't worked and was another massive waste of money and a gimmick. And what we've seen is that the Afghan army was a paper army. It was an army which only existed on the records and not in reality. And this isn't new. People are surprised by this. But the idea that it's still on the British Army website that they've trained 350,000 soldiers in Afghanistan. I had a look today, it's still on there. And I think when you look at the details and the data, I mean, figures vary. Maybe there was actually 150,000, and between 100,000 and 200,000 were just ghost soldiers who were never on paper. And the money which was being spent, their wages, was being pocketed by corrupt officials, dodgy generals. And so it's absolutely bizarre. It's absolutely bizarre and very, very sad and a huge waste of money. Yeah, corruption goes hand in hand with war, and particularly, I suppose, I mean, Iraq had a kind of functioning state to some degree, so it's quite different from Afghanistan. But it's definitely the case that in Afghanistan and in any war, corruption goes hand in hand with it. War is chaos, and war is an ample opportunity for every criminal and ne'er-do-well to try and cash in, and everybody was doing it, and lots of people in Afghanistan did it very successfully and cashed in on big Western contracts. And not just Afghans. Corruption isn't just an Afghan problem. The arms firms were cashing in, and private military contractors were cashing in. and coming away with huge sums. And they, they've the Brits and the Americans, the arms firms and contractors are safely in the UK and America and various other places. The people who really got rich out of corruption, who are Afghans, have squirreled their money away to places like Dubai and probably left. And it's the tragedy that the people who can afford it will be the first ones who get out, and the people who are left will be left to fend for themselves. If such a thing as humanitarian intervention really existed, I would be there myself. I think for a lot of us who went into the military naive and believed the rhetoric around what the British military does, it is a force for good in the world. We genuinely believe that, and you should believe that. You should want to help people around the world. Why that always means war, why that always means a military intervention, it's a different question. There are other ways to help people. I'm absolutely for it. I'm absolutely for humanitarian intervention of some kind, for helping people with aid or whatever, or mutual aid, mutual solidarity. I think that's a proper and moral human response. The problem is that idea, that concept veils imperialism. It's a kind of liberal veneer on a very old idea, which is about dominating other places, going in and restructuring countries in ways that suit us. I'm all for a new way of doing foreign policy, which is actually objectively moral and even-handed. I think as a concept, as if it wasn't already discredited, it is certainly discredited now. And I think the bootcut dads and the liberal columnists need to take a moment of reflection that what they've supported has again and again turned up massive humanitarian disasters. It just doesn't work. And I say that as a soldier who's been involved in humanitarian interventions, and I say that as a journalist who's been and seen that play out in Afghanistan as well. It's dead in the water. So maybe this is a time to reconsider how we intervene and how we can help people around the world properly, without squaddies, without kicking people's doors in, without Apache helicopters and gunships. Yeah, I think Macron's decision to lobby the EU to protect Europe from migrant flows from Afghanistan, I mean, it says it all, really, doesn't it? This is a man, a kind of liberal cause célèbre, the big brain people, the bootcut dads, the Cams and the Dunts, the Aronoviches was celebrating only a few years ago, has been revealed to be, basically he's doing Le Pen's work for the National Front Party. And I think that's absolutely typical of centrism today. I do believe there are still liberals, old-fashioned liberals who value human rights, but this is not them. That is not these people. And it's an absolute tragedy. We have the problems in Afghanistan are our problems, and they're a result of what we've done. And we have an obligation to help those people. And obviously that includes the people in Afghanistan and trying to get out, but there are lots of Afghans who until recently were going to be deported. I think they've just changed the rules on that. There are lots of Afghans throughout Europe and the Middle East and in neighbouring countries in Iran and Pakistan. And we've been there for many years, and it's a moral duty. If we're going to be a serious country, I don't believe in nation states, it's not my bag, okay? But if we're going to be a serious country, one thing we could do is to start looking to house those people and welcome them because they're in the situation they are because of us, and the scenes of the last few days has proved that beyond doubt. It's an opportunity. This can go one of a couple of ways. The British establishment, the military establishment, the generals, the press barons, the hawks in Labour and the Conservative Party will obviously continue to try and tie themselves to American power. But there is an opportunity here for an even-handed analysis and a reckoning and a move away from that, that urge to attach ourselves to the American military power, to the American elite. And that won't come from above. They won't do that. It will have to come from below. Whether this opportunity is taken, of course, is contingent on the forces which are at play. But this is an opportunity for us to divest from American power, accept the fact the age of pith helmets has gone, move away from the mythology, the kind of nostalgist, revanchist mythology of global Britain and become a sensible, normal country and play an even-handed role in the world. And the first thing we can do to do that, and we are in a situation which is dire, is to save as many people as we can, to let as many Afghans who want to come here and can get out, come here. Other countries, Canada, Albania, and various other countries, the Americans have said they will allow a number of people in, have done that, and we need to do that as well. We have an obligation, a moral obligation. These people are in a dire situation because of us, and we need to be humanist and rational and moral about this. This is an opportunity to do that and save as many Afghan people as we can. And if that involves them coming here, I'm absolutely fine with that. It's a really, really insidious argument which is made by people who would consider themselves liberals. Let's face it, that's where that comes from. The argument that that we intervene in places and that doing so helps women and children. First of all, there's something you can do to prove that now. If you want to help women and children in Afghanistan, you can lobby with all your energy to allow vulnerable women from Afghanistan into this country, give them refugee status, let them resettle here. You can put your money where your mouth is and do that. Beyond that, I know the British military inside and out. I was a soldier for 6 years, I've covered it for 10 years. I know the American military fairly well. Just in the last few months, we have seen evidence that there is an epidemic of sexual violence, sexual assault and sexual harassment in the ranks of both those militaries. To say that those organisations, which cannot even look after their own women, their women comrades in their ranks, are now or have ever been in the business of helping women overseas. To me, in the army, we have a term for that. It's called bullshit. I just don't buy it. I'm sorry, I just don't buy it. And if you are concerned about women, then you would look at places like Saudi Arabia, a close ally, recipient of millions of pounds worth and dollars worth of military equipment. You would look at women in the occupied territories in Palestine. You would look at, there's all kinds of women in Libya, the condition of women in Libya, where after intervention there were slave markets, literal slave markets. If you are concerned about women, then you should be concerned about all women and not just use the banner of feminism to justify military intervention. I think it's a deeply insidious argument and it's been disproven entirely. And let's remember, there's some fascinating statistics I read yesterday from Action on Armed Violence, fantastic little NGO. Airstrikes in Afghanistan, 40%, if I recall the figure correctly, of people who were killed in airstrikes were children. That is our airstrikes. Our occupation did not improve the condition of women and children in Afghanistan, women and young girls in Afghanistan. It's also important to remember, I think we tend to see Afghanistan through the prism of Kabul, which is anomalous. Kabul is an anomaly. It's the centre of foreign military power. When I was in Kabul, I saw girls wearing jeans, women riding bikes, and that's all good. But in the majority of Afghanistan, nothing much changed. The condition of women didn't improve. And when you occupy a place and bring war to someone's doorstep, it's important to remember all the things that women face, all the prejudices and problems and inequalities that women face normally in everyday life are exacerbated. You're adding to their problems when you bring war and occupation to their country. So we have to get away from this idea that the British military or the American military or any military is some kind of lib-fem organisation which is in the business of going around rescuing women. It's a profoundly condescending attitude, and it's quite kind of a misogynist attitude. Even when we look at Afghanistan, the gains which women did make, and maybe there were some gains made in Afghanistan, are often attributed to foreign military power, never to the struggles of women in those countries. I was having this conversation earlier today. It's always about we've gone there and we've improved the conditions of women. It completely ignores the struggle of Afghan women over many years, which has included their resistance to the foreign occupation and the Taliban. These people have fought on two fronts to make the few gains that they do have. And I just find that whole line of argument really disingenuous, really condescending, and just insidious. It's hard to say what will happen now. There have been some bizarre Adam Curtis-esque images of young Taliban fighters riding merry-go-rounds, going to the gym, and riding bumper cars in a fairground in Kabul. Really bizarre, really very strange. very strangely, and I don't know if it's significant, I'm not going to put any money on it. A senior Taliban figure was being interviewed on Tolo News by a woman interviewer, a woman broadcaster. I suspect it's probably just optics. I think in 1996, as I understand it, the first weeks of when the Taliban took over Kabul, there was some optimism, and that changed very quickly. My fear is that will also happen in Afghanistan. At the same time, the Taliban are probably very conscious of optics, in the same way that Western armies are, as we've seen, and they will want to say that things have changed. I will reserve my judgment till I see that. I suspect not, but it has led to some really bizarre imagery in the last few days. And it's also important to remember that the median age in Afghanistan is very young. I think it's about 18. And so a lot of these, the people riding fairgrounds and whatnot, are very young Afghan people who are obviously very jubilant. They feel they've, and correctly, they feel they've defeated the West and won the war. But it has led to some very, very strange scenes. It's absolutely to remember there's a tendency, a very paternalistic and very imperialistic tendency to look at Afghanistan as if it's a kind of creche which we're in charge of. And the whole question of whether or not we should leave Afghanistan ignores the fact that we had no right to be there in the first place. There's some very dubious and paternalistic tropes at play there, and I think we should be very cautious when we use them. I was in Afghanistan last year, terrifying to go back. I had this deep fear that I would have survived the war as a soldier and die as a journalist. But it was the first time I'd been there unarmed, no air support, as a civilian, talking to Afghans, actually talking and engaging with Afghans to the degree that I could as a Westerner. Understandably, people were probably also deeply suspicious of me. But my main role there was to examine the Zero units, which are CIA-run militias of Afghan troops. And they came into being. Basically, the kill or capture missions were previously run by the SAS, the Navy SEALs, Delta Force, Western Special Forces. And with the drawdown, that was handed over to Afghans. And those organisations, the Zero units, very unaccountable, run by the CIA, so they're unaccountable to Congress, run by the CIA, so they're unaccountable to the Afghan government, were involved in various atrocities. We spoke to people in Jalalabad, the family of 4 brothers who were murdered, and weapons were dropped on their body to frame them as terrorists, which they weren't. They weren't involved in the insurgency at all. We went out to a very remote village in a Toyota Corolla, absolutely terrifying on ID-stricken roads, and spoke to a community out there, and a man whose son had been their village was attacked. His son sought refuge next to the mosque. They dropped a Hellfire missile on the mosque. They dug his son's body out a few days later. Then the Zero units came in, killed various people, ruined a lot of the infrastructure, burned the petrol station, which is a major local source of income. And so our job was to try and we were chasing the CIA and their militias. These totally unaccountable, heavily armed, Western trained militias who have been carrying out various human rights abuses against Afghan people. And I confronted an Afghan security spokesman about this, and it became very clear that it was frustrating for the Afghan government also, because the Afghan government, what could they tell the people when the people came to them and said, our families have been killed? Because the Afghan government had it was never really in charge, and I think that tells a story. The Afghan government was never really in charge of its own security. And as I said, those groups were also unaccountable to the American people because they're run by the CIA, and CIA isn't accountable to Congress. So it really tells a story about the nature of US power and the fragility and the lack of power of the Afghan government, which was in effect completely reliant on US military power. So some of the people I worked with and some of the people I interviewed out there are obviously still in Afghanistan. Obviously they'll remain nameless because they're vulnerable people. There's been rumours that in certain areas the Taliban are going door to door trying to find journalists who've worked with the foreign occupier, as they would term it. And so, yeah, a couple of people have chosen to stay, but are in danger and worried. Some people tried to get out. and some of those people have gone quiet now. We can't get in touch with them. What particularly struck me though was a group of very optimistic, very sweet Afghan kids, probably 40, 60, a mix of young men and young women, who were really kind of striving for hope and trying to build a kind of optimistic future. And they were absolutely fantastic characters. I've tried to get in touch with them. I haven't had anything back so far, but obviously I'm deeply concerned that these people, the next generation of Afghans, are hugely at risk, and it's really that's a real tragedy for me, because they were the nicest, sweetest, funniest kids. People forget Afghans love banter. Afghans are hilarious, and I had spent an afternoon with them, and they were hilarious. They took the mickey out of me, and I had a pop back, and they're just absolutely warm, generous, and hilarious people. And it really cuts me to not know where they are or if they're safe. There are concerns that the Taliban will come in and their presence will diminish human rights, and they're justified concerns. So that could well be the case. But it's also true that the occupation diminished human rights. Outside Kabul, which is this anomalous kind of hub of US power propped up by foreign powers, human rights have continued to be an issue, and in many cases have been exacerbated by the occupation. So I think you're on slightly dodgy ground if you're saying you're only pointing at the Taliban and talking about human rights concerns in relation to them, because there have also been consistently human rights concerns emerging from the occupation, from the Western military presence. We've seen various atrocities. The British military carried out various atrocities. The Australian military, the US military, there were various murders and massacres of innocent Afghans. The drone war, the bombings, the reliance on air power, particularly as the large bulk of troops left. It was the Afghan military, but with Western air power, in many cases extremely indiscriminate. All of these are human rights issues. And human rights issues don't just emerge from the Taliban. I think we have to just be honest and rational, even-handed about this. Throughout the occupation, the Afghan people have suffered enormously. The foreign powers who occupied Afghanistan are absolutely guilty of human rights abuses and war crimes in Afghanistan. I don't think there's any question about that. And if people are saying they're not, then their integrity should be questioned. The war on terror, a disaster from start to finish, I would say. And I suppose from a more personal perspective, it's the thing which has framed my entire adult life. I'm 40 next year, believe it or not. And I can remember being a young, working class kid. I can remember I was unglamorously fitting a carpet, and I was listening to the radio. It was like a Saturday job, and the guy with me was a Falklands veteran, and we heard the news that the two towers had been hit, and he said the world has changed, and of course it had. He was right. And it's the kind of background music, if you like, to my entire adult life. And I, in the end, became, of course, involved in it as a soldier first, later as an activist and as a journalist. And it's a tragic thing. I mean, when you look at, and maybe, I don't know if this is the end game of it. Clearly the impacts of the war on terror will continue to play out. Less so for us, we're quite comfortable here in Britain. But for the people in those regions, it's an absolute tragedy. And of course the big ones are Iraq and Afghanistan. But within the framework of the war on terror and the rhetoric of the war on terror, we've had Syria, we've had the tragedy in Libya, Yemen, often unmentioned, another one for the women's and human rights enthusiasts of the liberal commentariat. We've had rendition. One of the many tragedies of it is that the people who led this thing up, who've caused untold suffering to so many people, are still seen as serious people. And many of them, obviously, I mean, wherever you stand on the EU, reconditioned themselves with the kind of Remain the campaign and the anti-Corbyn campaign, the Campbells, the Blairs, people like this. You would think that is the one thing we could do, given how far away we are from the theatres of war, is try and hold those people to account. But no, these people are on morning television, for Christ's sake. The butchers the butchers of Baghdad and Basra are still seen as serious people. It's unbelievable. It's surreal. It's more surreal even than when you think about it, than seeing those Taliban fighters in their bumper cars yesterday and messing around in the gym. It's just so hard to put into context. I think probably we've become numb to it. We've become numb to the strangenesses of the war on terror, and that's probably it's very parochial. It's because it's something that happens over there, and many of us only really get to hear about it through very sterilised news reports and so on. But yeah, I mean, I'm saddened, I suppose, and it's probably quite a privileged thing to say. I'm saddened that the background of most of my adult life is this horrendous campaign which has caught up so many people in different countries around the world who are entirely innocent. Like Afghans just want to crack on with their lives, and so do Iraqis and Libyans and people from Yemen. It's hard to put into context, but it's just so sad. It's an age of terror, but it's also an age of massive deceit, and in some cases self-deceit. There are lots of it. I think from this will emerge after wars, and I speak as a veteran and someone who's interested in veteran stuff. I've just written another book about veterans culture. There always emerges from these things a kind of stab in the back theory, a Dolchstoss. We saw this after the American Civil War, after the Vietnam War. We saw it with after the First World War with the rise of the Freikorps, who formed some of the basis of the Nazi movement. And there's a tendency to blame the left, to blame liberals, to blame communists, to blame the enemy within, to blame Jewish people, as it was after the First World War. And it's right, people are angry and they're easily confused, and it's right that they should be angry, but the real culprits, the liars and the deceivers, are the press barons, are the arms firms, are the politicians, with honourable exceptions, and the generals, all of whom have come out of this scot-free. But certainly the whole thing has been coloured by just massive deceit. And the obvious example is that if you looked back at press reports over just the last 10 years about Afghanistan, you could probably come away with a fairly rosy picture that progress is being made, that girls are going to school. And the last few days, I think that's been revealed as another massive lie, endlessly repeated by politicians and senior military leaders and parroted by establishment journalists. So I think the public could be forgiven for thinking that, because they've been lied to. They've been lied to. But it's important when the stab in the back theory formulates, and it is formulating now, and they start to try. We've already seen them trying to blame Jeremy Corbyn and the anti-war movement, of all people, blame the anti-war movement for the outcome in the war on terror. I can't brag. I was joining the army when my mum was on the big march against Iraq. But when I did get wise to it, I joined it. Obviously, everything they've said, whatever you think of them objectively, everything the anti-war movement said 20 years ago has come to pass, almost word for word. Perhaps they are even surprised by how right they got it. I don't know. It's just interesting to me that those people are again being pilloried when they called it all right. There's something really dubious going on there. Jeremy Corbyn was one of the few people, the few MPs who voted against the war early on, 2001, in the wake of 9/11. Again, he's being pilloried. And it's important. I was a critical supporter of Corbynism. I'm not like a hardcore Labour person. I'm a long way to the left, and as I think a lot of people were. But his voice and the voices around him have been proven right, whatever you think of them. And you should be able to say that, whether you are a Tory or a Liberal or a Socialist or an anarchist. It's just objectively true that these people called it, and they were right. Let's just take it on the chin, guys. I'm not crowing about it. I wish we weren't right, and I wish in Afghanistan and Iraq we had invaded and formed some kind of paradise, but that didn't happen. I wish that the Iraqis and Afghan people hadn't suffered so dreadfully, but they did, and there's no excuses because you were warned. Bush's rehabilitation is a strange and sad feature of this. I know they're all slinging mud at each other at the moment. Was it Biden? Was it Trump? I blame them all equally, from Biden and Bush through to Boris and Blair. They're all to blame, but Bush's rehabilitation is particularly irks me. And also, it particularly irks me on a personal level because part of that was done through the kind of veterans charity movement. I remember being shocked, I think it was about 2017, the Invictus Games, a kind of Olympic Games for wounded veterans. Why we need that when we already have a Paralympic Games, I don't know. Well, I do know because it was a vehicle for hero worshipping soldiers, and Harry's role as a kind of establishment figure. But I remember these fascinating images: George Bush, Prince Harry, an Afghan veteran, shaking hands, joking on stage at an event for wounded soldiers. There you have the architect of their mutilation and injury. And that, for me as a veteran, was particularly irksome. Of course, it's broader than that. Bush, possibly against... it's interesting that a lot of liberals started to kind of long for Bush because of Trump. But of course, he is one of the key architects, and the people around him, the Rumsfelds, the Kissingers, and so on, of this whole thing. And it's particularly grotesque to me that this man has been kind of rehabilitated, but rehabilitated by liberals for a large part. It's almost like a weird longing for the good old days of Bush, and they've reduced him to this slightly eccentric old man who likes painting. And not what he is, which is, of course, a war criminal. I mean, he has enormous amounts of blood on his hands, as does Tony Blair and every leader and prime minister up until today, I would argue. The part of Biden's statement which particularly irked me was the part where he said American troops shouldn't be dying in Afghanistan because the Afghans aren't willing to fight for their own country. Just it's a weird mix of kind of victim blaming and gaslighting, and it just doesn't stand up. Afghan troops died in their thousands. Their rates of death were vastly higher than US or British casualties, and it just seems deeply grotesque to me. I'm not even sure what audience he is playing to. It's just objectively a lie, and it doesn't stand up to the figures of suffering among the Afghan National Army and Afghan National Police. It's an old imperial trope: butcher and bolt, go in, punish, and leave. The problem was that they stayed for 20 years. They didn't just go in, punish and leave, and tried to go into nation building supposedly and all these kinds of things. But it's absolutely grotesque, but not all surprising. I mean, Biden, like Clinton and the kind of left flank of the establishment, if they can be called that, are absolutely implicated in this whole thing. It grieves me to see how people like Bernie Sanders were outflanked by the Democrat establishment in America. And I mean, Sanders was never a Corbyn. Corbyn was always better. But still, the Americans had that opportunity. And I talk to American veterans a lot. I have a lot of good, British veterans, anti-war veterans have a lot of good relationships with American veterans. We call it the other special relationship. And to see their disappointment, the blow to them, which we had with when Corbynism was outmanoeuvred and collapsed, outmanoeuvred by the Labour Party and the press for a large part. It's a real tragedy, and it speaks to the missed opportunity that we have this man who's absolutely committed to American imperialism, every bit as much as Bush and Trump and Blair and the lot of them, absolute mingers. We were regularly and consistently misled on the prospects of a fairer, better, more just settlement in Afghanistan, or even just success on any metric, really. It's actually 2 years ago since those Afghan papers came out, which revealed that the US government had been consistently lying to the population, and the same is very much true in this country. Lots of people are the culprits for that. There is a trend in journalism that journalists snuggle up to the military, and we see that on all the main newspapers, the Skies, the Telegraphs, the Mails, even the Guardians. And I noticed the Guardian got rid of its really good foreign commentators, the Ian Cobains and Richard Norton-Taylors of this world. So it's a mix of things. It's the MOD giving press releases to journalists, but the journalists probably want to stay on side. They want to keep access to the military, and so very often they report what the MOD says uncritically without even a counterpoint. And it's not like they don't have Stop the War's phone number to ring up and get a counterpoint. Yeah, it astonishes me that even now, 20 years on, that some of the main players who pushed for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are still given primetime billing. Yesterday I opened Twitter. I was trying to not tweet because it was affecting me. It was affecting my mental health. The endless following of updates in a topic you're invested in. But I did, to be confronted with David Miliband on Channel 4. And I know there's some good journalists at Channel 4, some good people at Channel 4 still. But I found on Channel 4, David Miliband interviewed, now the head of a major charity, the man who was a foreign secretary, a Labour foreign secretary, heavily implicated in rendition, which is shorthand for kidnapping, torture, and torture of people, sending them off to Guantanamo Bay, to black sites in the Middle East. Primetime billing, as if he is a serious figure, as if this fool and these fools and these clowns and these failures are serious people who should be listened to, All the Afghan voices you could cite, all the Iraqi or Libyan voices you could cite, all the critics in the West, that should be the second tier that you could cite and talk to, and they find primetime billing for someone like David Miliband. And it's not just to single him out. Alistair Campbell is on Good Morning Britain, isn't it? He's primetime billing. You wake up, I don't watch it obviously, but these people have been reconditioned to such an extent, and they should never have been allowed. And it really, to be reconditioned, it really speaks to just the political culture and the media culture in Britain, that these people are allowed anywhere near, or are not even critically questioned, Have them on the news, but at least critically question them about their involvement. It's a really dire commentary on political and media culture in this country. It really is. There's a weird tendency that, particularly among Liberals, I give the Liberals a lot of flack, and rightly so, I think, because they are, after all, the ones who sent me and my mates to war, and some of us never came back. Some of us came back damaged. It was absolutely the centre, Blairism, Blairites, and the people around him who did that. But there is a thing, isn't there, that as soon as the flights to Kabul are suspended, every Dunt, every Cam, every Aronovich, all these kind of or the centrists are suddenly war horny. So one tweet really stood out to me yesterday. It was a guy, Matthew something, who tweeted out that it was the first time in his life he wanted to join the army and go and fight. And I imagine he's much too well-heeled to ever be in the ranks, to be honest. But it's a kind of a thing particularly among kind of the centrist commentariat, that all of a sudden they're ready to put on their tin hat and get in the trenches. And of course it's ridiculous. I don't think they'd last 5 seconds in a place like that. I'm sure they would just completely collapse. That said, I mean, go for it. If these people are keen to go and fight the Taliban, put them on a plane, strap a parachute on them and send them in. But joking aside, it's something about kind of liberal, about centrist manhood, that they're all eager to go and fight and kill as soon as the flights are suspended to the place where the killing's happening. These are not serious people to me. It's just posturing, and it's just silly. You should be in no rush to go to war. And if you had half an idea what it was like, you wouldn't be coming out with those kind of grandiose statements, to be honest. It's hard to look at this and maintain hope, or find glimmers of hope. I always find there's a profoundly racist argument which is that the 101st Airborne or 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, have to go in and they have to rescue these people. And it's a profoundly racist argument, as if these people can't rescue themselves given the opportunity. And I find hope, particularly in those, I'm very worried about where they are at the moment, those young Afghan activists. They were very hopeful. They were very optimistic, a lot less jaded and more optimistic than me, but I find hope in the young people in those countries and their capacity to try and shrug off not just foreign military power, but also the Taliban. I think there's hope in that, and those are the people we should support, and we should support them on the terms which they they should frame those terms. No one ever in the war on terror, none of the warmongers ever in the war on terror asked your average Afghan or Iraqi what they thought should be done. They always choose their favourites from the diaspora communities in their countries, like the Karzai, al-Maliki, and kind of go with them and parachute them into power. So I think you always find where there is hope, where it exists below the kind of spectrum of respectable power which US and British establishments tend to frame everything through. So there is hope there. And there's also hope in this country. I remember when I came out of the army, I went to uni. I was 28, and a lot of the young kids who were like 19, 20, their first political act in this country, and it stung them because it didn't work, but their first political act in this country was walking out of school during the kind of school strikes in the anti-war movement. And obviously people are jaded because it didn't quite come off, that the wars proceeded anyway, maybe on different terms, but the wars proceeded. But I think you find hope in younger people, and I think the kind of Gen X, I see a lot of hope in Gen X. I think Gen X are a totally different beast from jaded old. I suppose I'm kind of a senior millennial. I'm 1982, so I just come under that, I like to say. But I think these young kids you see have so much energy, and their politics are just so much more developed now. And I find hope with those much younger people now. I think they take much less bullshit, and their politics are much more coherent around lots of issues, not just imperialism, around the climate and all these kinds of things. So I think if I was to look for hope, I think I look for it there, and we should give those young people their heads and encourage them and help them. And to be honest, also know when to get out of the way and let them do their thing. I think that's where I search for hope across a range of issues, but also around imperialism and colonialism. What lessons can be learned, I suppose? Well, there's a number. First of all, that liberal interventionism is dead. It's dead in the water. It's over. And we need to step away from it. It's completely discredited. They will make the argument, just because we can't intervene everywhere doesn't mean we shouldn't intervene somewhere. And it's just vapid. Their problem is that they always frame, by liberal intervention, they mean military invasion. That's fundamentally what it comes down to. Let's strip away the bullshit for a minute. They want to be able to go and invade places and violently project power, and they think that with war, that war can be a route to some kind of humanitarian process. And I don't think that's the case. So a key lesson to take away from this is that liberal imperialism, let's call it what it is, and interventionism is dead. It's dead in the water. It's over. It's done. Stop talking about it. Stop being a clown. Grow up. If you want to help people, there are lots of ways you can do that. Only a couple of months ago, they cut the aid budget to Afghanistan by 78%, I think it was, which tells you what the British establishment really, the degree to which they really care about Afghans. For example, there are lots of ways you can help, but that is a key lesson. That thing, whatever it was, is discredited and dead. No more liberal interventionism. Stop talking about it. That's a key lesson. Another key lesson, we need to develop new sources of media. The mainstream media, I don't even like that term, I find it clunky and annoying, but the mainstream media in this country has covered itself in shame, snuggling up to the military, repeating what politicians say verbatim and uncritically. There are other places you can go for good media, for proper reportage. They exist now over a period of many years, but we've started to build those, support them. Another lesson, I think, is to step away from the kind of paternalistic and at its core racist and orientalist tendency to not really inquire among Afghans and Iraqis what they think we should do. They do have opinions on this. They're not aliens. They are invested in this. Clearly it's involved in them. Listen to Iraqi and Afghan people. Engage seriously with what they want. Don't just decide for them and send in the Royal Marines. When I was out in Afghanistan, I was fascinated by the sophistication and the depth of analysis and the powerful opinions and the clarity of what young Afghans were saying and their hopes for the future and the way they expressed them. They were absolutely fascinating, and they should be listened to. And the same with Iraqis and Yemenis and Libyans and so on and so on. These people's voices are so often missing from the narrative, and that shouldn't be the case. Listen to what the people who are in those places have to say, for God's sake. Surely that is a key lesson that we have to learn, that's come out of this. Not to just charge in like a bull in a china shop, and just do whatever we think is right with no basis in what the people in those countries want. Let's start to take those people seriously, and step away from this kind of paternalistic attitude that we often have. And it exists, it's not just the Tories or the Liberals, I think that exists across the political spectrum at times, in this country and in the US, that we decide for people what's best for them. It's absolutely wrong, and we need to engage and listen to people.